Hi, can I please speak to Professor Chomsky? My name is Ian McKinnon. I'm calling from CITR Radio in Vancouver. I have a scheduled interview with him this morning. Good morning, Professor Chomsky. Great. This is Ian McKinnon from CITR Radio. Yeah, I'm just getting everything set up here. And no, this is a taped interview. Okay. So I'll just put you through the board here. There might be a little bit of a scream, so you might want to take the phone away from your ear for just a second. Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'll just get your level.
Okay, how's that?
Great. Well, while we're just getting things set up here, let me just ask you if you've seen or heard of the play, the Noam Chomsky Lectures, co-written by a Vancouver playwright named Guillermo Verdicchio.
I heard of it, and in fact, somebody sent me, I think it's kind of ad-libbed, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's every show is different.
Okay, somebody sent me something, I forget what. I guess something must have been published. Yeah.
Okay. All right. With me in studio is Jonathan Oppenheim, who's a show host also with CITR.
You're from the university? Or?
Yeah, UBC Radio. And we've actually spoken before. You probably don't remember. I asked two questions as part of a panel discussion with you a couple of years ago.
I can barely remember last week.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay. I think Jonathan's got the first question, so I'll let him have that. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to start with, since most of your writing is about the U.S., I want to get your perspective on some Canadian institutions. So to start with the Canadian mass media, do you think there's more open public debate in Canada?
Well, there's good reason why most of my writing's about the U.S. And a few other places that I really know well. I'd prefer to write about things I know about rather than things I don't know about. In the case of the media, most of the work on the media, in my view, the best publicized work is almost totally valueless. Take a recent book by James Fallows, which is sort of a bestseller on the media, and that's basically his impressions. That's of no interest. Serious work is based on actual careful analysis. Now, in the case of the Canadian media, I have impressions and even some information. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been any, at least I haven't seen any really careful analysis, and I haven't done it. I'll just give you one bit of experience, which will illustrate what I think. A couple of years ago, it must have been about 1988, I gave the Massey lectures over CBC on the media. They had invited me to give lectures, and they wanted me to talk about the media. So I thought it would be interesting to compare the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, just to see how they, treated stories, chose, selected, interpreted, and so on. They look like the obvious two counter things to compare. So, in fact, I subscribed to the Globe and Mail for a year. I was one of about 1,000 subscribers, I guess, in the United States. And I read it carefully, and I finally didn't do it. If you look at the lectures, there's nothing about this. The reason I didn't do it is that I discovered that although there were stories in the Globe and Mail that didn't get to the New York Times, and I know of many stories in the Toronto Star and the Vancouver Sun and others that didn't make it to the mainstream press. Nevertheless, overall, the Globe and Mail was treating the world pretty much the way a kind of local quality journal in the United States would, say, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or Los Angeles Times, maybe, or something like that. It wasn't. It was much narrower in focus and much more business-oriented in focus, and its general coverage, with occasional exceptions, was not very different. Well, that's 1 year's worth of one newspaper. As I say, I know that there are other things. Take, for example, Linda Diebel's reports in the Star on Haiti, just to pick one. Well, a lot of that didn't appear in the United States, and she's a really first-rate reporter who did all sorts of important things. And I would say my general impression is that the Canadian press is a little bit like the press, the quality press that's right outside the ideological mainstream in the United States. If you look at, say, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, you'll also find things that wouldn't make it through to the New York Times. I think the general point is that, in fact, the same is true. This has been one thing that has been studied, which bears on this, is National Public Radio in the United States, which is considered probably correctly to be sort of on the liberal side of the spectrum. In fact, often condemned for that, and I basically agree with the characterization. There are people, David Barsamian, who you may know, who distributes lots of tapes of sort of dissident. He runs community radio, and he does lots of tapes, which he distributes all over the place. I'm one of his. Lots of talks of mine, of Alex Coburn, of Ed Said, of other people who are kind of on the fringes of the mainstream. He distributes their tapes, and he's had a lot of experience with public radio. He finds that he's written about it in the sort of ideological centers, like, for example, Boston or Washington or New York. It's extremely hard to get anything played. As you move further away, you go out sort of towards, Kansas and Idaho and Oregon and so on, then it's a lot easier. The constraints just decline. And my impression is that Canada is sort of the same. I mean, the constraints decline. And the reasons are not difficult to see. Suppose you're sitting in a public relations firm and you want to make sure that people think a certain way, which is what the public relations industry spends billions of dollars a year for. You really care about the way people think in the regions where they can where they have an effective role in decision making. You care less when they're sort of less involved in decision making. Now, in the United States, it's taken for granted that most of the large part of the population is just out of the political system. It's supposed to be run by what are called responsible men who understand the interests of the powerful, and the rest of the population is to be marginalized. In fact, the system was set up that way 200 years ago, and contemporary situation is very different, but basically that principle remains and even remains articulated, and that has an effect on the nature of the media. There's a big difference between the way in which, there's a notable difference, let's say, between the way in which the information is both filtered and interpreted in a place like, say, the New York Times, where they know that they're creating history. History is what's in the New York Times archives, not in the Dayton, Ohio Journal archives. And also they are addressing the political class, the small sector of the population, of the small elite sector of the population. Actually, that has complicated consequences. On the one hand, they have to ensure a particular way of looking at the world. On the other hand, they have to present a tolerably realistic picture of the world, because these people are in the decision-making positions which matter to those with power. And in fact, when you go over to the business press, say the Wall Street Journal, you have, in my opinion, some of the best reporting in the country. Their audience just has to know the reality of things. So it's not a trivial question. It's many complicated aspects, but my general, to get back to your original question, though I wouldn't presume to talk about the Canadian media without having studied them, the impression that I have, based on the kind of evidence I mentioned, is more or less is that it tends to be it tends to fall under the kind of principle that the more you move away from the centers of power, the less rigid constraints are on interpretation and analysis and presentation of information.
To what extent do Canadians live in a democracy? I don't know. I'm not sure how much
Yeah.
you know about this, but
Well, I mean, democracy isn't a yes or no affair. You're right about extent. The problem is that it's not just extent; it has many dimensions. So, in some respects, Canadian democracy is flourishing. In other respects, it's very marginal. Take the one criterion of democracy is the capacity of the state to coerce people, to force you to do things. Well, by that standard, Canada is very free, like the United States. The state has rather limited capacity to coerce. Actually, the U.S. is even more free because Canada does not have the protection for freedom of speech that the United States does. But it's, by comparative standards, quite free in terms of the opportunities that are provided to people to survive. Well, Canada's sort of somewhere in between the United States, which is rather low on that scale, and say continental Europe, much of which is much higher on that scale. And Canada's sort of halfway between, and things like social services and so on, and indeed declining toward the U.S. level. In terms of political participation, it's a very mixed story. In any state capitalist society, which has decision-making power concentrated in what are in effect totalitarian institutions, namely big corporations, and in the case of Canada, a lot of them foreign, meaning U.S.-owned ones. Well, that obviously limits public participation in any meaningful choices, and that undermines democracy. And both Canada and the United States are moving more and more towards that, towards shifting power to private tyrannies, so they're out of the public domain. That's what's called liberalization, in a nice Orwellian term. And in general, there are many dimensions. You just have to look at them one by one. Overall, Canadian democracy is probably on the high end of by comparative standards, which doesn't mean very high, in my opinion.
You mentioned in your answer, sorry, Ian McKinnon again. You mentioned in your answer how our social democracy in Canada is declining towards the U.S. level, and in Canada, with this going on, with the dismantling of our social programs, under the guise of reducing the public debt, the main protesters against these cuts are the trade unions. I was wondering if you had any prescription for what more trade unions can do to protect our social programs.
Well, first of all, they can exist, which is not easy these days. There's been a concentrated attack against among the industrial societies. The United States is in the lead. A huge attack against unions began actually the United States happens to have a very violent labor history, but right after the first in the mid-30s, popular activism reached such a point that the U.S. did move more or less into the mainstream of industrial society, providing worker rights and so on, and immediately a huge campaign was launched against unions. It picked up after the Second World War, and it was quite extraordinary in scale. There's a good reason for that. Whatever one thinks of unions, I mean, all kind of criticisms and this and that, they're one of the few ways in which ordinary people, working people, which means most everybody, can get together to pool very limited resources, interact, enter the political arena, and in other ways contribute to the democratization of the society. And naturally, those with power want to prevent that. They don't want a democratic society. They're quite frank about it. And since unions have been always, by and large, a democratizing force and a way of trying to place in the political arena and in the social system generally the needs and concerns and interests of most of the population, they're a threat. And there's been a big attack on them. The attack during the Reagan years reached the level of straight criminality. Again, you have to turn to the business press to get an accurate report of this, but the laws in order to undermine and destroy unions, and it was reasonably successful. That's on top of huge propaganda campaigns and so on. Well, in Canada, it hasn't been as bad. The labor movement is stronger and has maintained itself more, and that contributes to Canadian democracy. On the other hand, it's seriously under attack. Canada's kind of, maybe a couple of decades behind the United States in these processes, and that will be a further attack on democracy. And just as in the United States, population, as in the past many times, it's not the first time that there's been a business assault, trying to take not just dominant control, but your total control over the society. It was true in the 20s, for example. And there have been periodic cycles of struggle, victory, defeat, expansion of freedom and justice, and so on. We happen to be in one of the periods of defeat for most of the population, but it's not the first time, and it won't be the last time, and it has to be overcome.
Gerry Adams of Sinn Féin has said that Bill Clinton is the only person that can save Ireland from civil war. What's up with that?
Well, it'll basically be Ireland and Britain that settle that question. Clinton does have, in any part of the world, in particular there, the United States has plenty of clout. I think the moves towards the diminution of violence, which for some period, and the moves towards interaction among the communities, that was pretty helpful, and I think Clinton did have a positive role in that. On the other hand, there are big problems that have simply not been resolved. There is one fundamental problem of principle, and that is what Ireland is. So suppose you believe in, you're really a Democrat. You believe the people ought to make their own decisions. That doesn't answer the question of what happens in Northern Ireland, because you have to decide whether it's the people of Northern Ireland who decide or the people of Ireland who decide. Well, those are just different assumptions, and on that there's a real split, and it's not an easy one to resolve. You can sort of scream about it, but to give a principled resolution is not simple. There are other issues. The current ceasefire broke down, one hopes temporarily, in part, I think in significant part, on what looks like a narrow issue, but isn't really a narrow issue, and that is whether a condition for the British have insisted that if the IRA is to enter negotiations, it must, as a precondition, disarm. On the other hand, the British don't have to disarm, obviously. Well, from the point of view of the British government, maybe that looks pretty reasonable, but from the point of view of the IRA, it looks very unreasonable. Their alternative proposal, more or less conveyed through Sinn Féin, is that the disarmament and demobilization be part of the ongoing negotiation process. Well, that looks like a small technical problem, but if you think it through, it's a serious problem of principle. And those are not simple to resolve. No one, that I can't see any justification for blowing up buses and that sort of thing. But the issues that underlie it are not so simple.
If you look at other peace processes like Somalia and the Middle East and Bosnia, the U.S. has taken a central role in those, or claims to have. What do you make of this new U.S. role as sort of the world peacekeeper?
First of all, the U.S. international role is certainly not new. The U.S. has been the overwhelmingly dominant power in the world since 1945, and the U.S. is not a peacekeeper. Never has been and isn't now. The examples you mention are cases where the rule of force was imposed. There's no, it's peace in a way, but everybody imposes peace, even Genghis Khan. If you look at the kind of peace that was imposed, you find that it was simply the rule of force. In Somalia, the U.S. moved in basically after when the fighting was declining and the famine was declining, and the prospects looked pretty good for what amounted to a public relations coup. Well, U.S. has an unusual military doctrine. That's why, maybe unique. That's why U.S. forces don't participate in peacekeeping operations, like contrary to, say, Canadian forces or forces from Norway or the Fiji Islands and so on. U.S. military doctrine is that U.S. troops are not permitted to be placed under any threat whatsoever. So if someone makes a threatening gesture, you call in the helicopter gunships. Now that basically disqualifies the United States from participation in any operation that involves civilians. U.S. forces can be used to separate warring armies or something like that, where an overwhelming display of force can be brought if there's any problem, but not where civilians are involved. And in fact, if you look around peacekeeping operations, you find that that's true, and has been. In the case of Somalia, it looked as if nothing was going to happen, just some sort of teenagers with rifles. But there were threats of a kind that you get in any complicated situation, and the U.S. reacted with massive force. The whole thing ended up in a complete catastrophe. According to Washington sources, about 7,500 or 10,000 Somali civilians were killed during the U.S. When the U.S. was in there. Then the U.S. pulled out, just leaving it more or less as it was. So that's not a peacekeeping operation. In the case of Bosnia, the United States stood on the sidelines as long as the situation was complicated and difficult. In fact, I think made the situation worse. The U.S. did authorize military support for what it expects to be its client, Croatia, and to an extent to Bosnia, mostly via Croatia, including authorization of support from Iran, which was known but kept quiet and is now being conceded. On the other hand, its own involvement was going to be limited to bombing, if anybody wanted bombing, not engagement in difficult operations on the ground. At a point where it seemed as if the two sides were more or less balanced militarily, and where the level of exhaustion and despair was such that they might be willing to put down their arms, at that point the U.S. moved in and instituted what amounts to partition of Bosnia between a Croatian-dominated and a Serbian-dominated part. And the U.S. forces moved in with what they called robust rules of engagement. They're very explicit about this. The National Security Advisor and the Pentagon and the Defense Secretary made it very clear, and Clinton underscored it, that if there's any threat to U.S. troops, they will use massive force. Any threat. Well, they're hoping at this point they just separate warring factions and impose a kind of partition, with a greater Croatia being more or less a U.S. client, and they anticipate a greater Serbia being a U.S. client as well. That will restore something like the situation prior to the breakup of Yugoslavia as far as U.S. power is concerned. You can call it peacekeeping if you want, but it's a funny term for it. In the Middle East, it's just outright rule of force. Go from the details now, but for about 25 years, the U.S. has stood virtually alone against the world in demanding an extreme rejectionist settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict, in which Palestinians basically have no rights. And it instituted. After the Gulf War, the U.S. was in a position to institute unilaterally its own extreme rejectionist policies, and that's pretty much what happened. Again, I'm not call it peacekeeping if you like, but in my view, that's a propaganda term.
Professor Chomsky, it's Ian McKinnon again. I just wanted to let you know a little bit about the university in the city that you're going to be coming to shortly, I guess next week. Mm-hmm. The University of British Columbia is a very corporate-minded campus. We have more companies on campus than any other Canadian school, particularly in research. And there's also heavy involvement in the pharmacy and forestry departments from corporations. And we've just signed a huge deal. I don't know, you may have heard something about this because it's a copy of some American universities. We've just signed a huge deal with Coke, making them something like a corporate sponsor for the university. Is any of this dangerous?
Look, any intrusion of private tyrannical power in any domain of life is dangerous. It's illegitimate, in my opinion. The whole power system is illegitimate. So, of course, anything it does is dangerous, at least if you believe in freedom and democracy and so on. On the other hand, and that's particularly true in universities. I mean, I know the story very well in my own university, which lives on soft money, on money coming in. On the other hand, we have to recognize some fact about our political economy, namely, universities are parasitic institutions economically. They don't generate their own capital, and that means it comes from somewhere. Well, it can come from the government, and in that case, it's as democratic as the government is, which means more or less, not very complicated, but to some extent. It can come from rich alumni, in which case it represents their interests. It can come from private power, private corporations, in which what happens represents their interests. No, it's not 100%. So, some Merck pharmaceutical may support on the side some, biological research that's of no special concern to them, but that's unlikely. Corporate, in fact, this is well known. I'm going to take the United States, where I see it, know it better, and in fact, it's it's so clear. It's even in the science journals. There has been a shift from federal to corporate funding over the last couple of years, and the effects are very notable. One effect is that work becomes much more. Work is trivialized, becomes more short-term and product-oriented, and there's a simple reason for this. Merck Pharmaceutical or any other corporation is not a humanitarian organization. They're in the business of making profit and power. And from their point of view, the public ought to pay the costs of research and development that are of general benefit, potential benefit, but they're only interested in paying the costs of things that they benefit from and not, the pharmaceutical corporation across the street. That's what corporations are. No point pretending they're anything else. That means that they are willing to support work that they will benefit from in the relatively short term. And they would much prefer, in fact, demand that the general public pay the costs of work that they may benefit from down the road, and others may too. So as funding shifts more toward the corporate sector, you get much more pressure to do short-term applied work of a specific character. Also, corporate funding imposes more and more secrecy. Now, they can't legally impose secrecy, at least in the United States, so they cannot order people who get a grant not to talk about the work they're doing or not to publish it. But there are indirect ways to achieve the same end. For example, an indication that the project won't get refunded otherwise. That has its effects, and they're very noticeable. During the period when, say, MIT, where I am, was the Pentagon happens to be the most free and open funder, contrary to what a lot of people believe, because they didn't care much. I mean, they just understood themselves to be the funnel by which public funds go to private industry through the research system. So they didn't really care much what anybody was doing, and basic science could flourish and so on. There were no MIT was overwhelmingly funded by the Pentagon, even the CIA, and there were no secrecy conditions. People talked quite freely about what they were doing. There was no classified research and so on. On the other hand, as it moves more and more toward corporate funding, the kind of pall of silence falls. People just notice. Talk to the faculty; they'll tell you about it. That things get the constraints on discussing what you're doing increase, and the pressure of private power increases. In fact, right in this morning's newspaper, there's an example of that with regard to MIT. There's a professor in the political science department who's a specialist in military affairs who's been working on the Patriot missiles during the Gulf War, and he's done research which is apparently correct, that showing that they really didn't achieve anything. That contrary to Raytheon claims, Raytheon's a corporation that produces them, the biggest corporation in Massachusetts. Well, he claims, and it's debated, that MIT is under pressure from Raytheon on the threat of reduction of funding to constrain him from continuing with the research. Well, I don't have no judgment on the merits of this particular case, but that's the kind of thing that one expects to happen, and that certainly does happen. And it's intrinsic, it's implicit in the nature of private power. From Adam Smith to Milton Friedman, they'll be happy to explain to you correctly that corporations are in the business of maximizing their own profit and power. They are not in the business of helping people. And if they were, it would be improper, in fact, illegal.
On March 5th, you're going to be at UBC talking about activism. I was wondering what sort of stuff you're going to be talking about.
These kinds of things, very much, in fact. I won't really be talking about activism. I'll be talking about the issues that I think activism ought to address. There isn't much to say about activism except do it.
Okay, Ian McKinnon again. A couple of years ago, this is one of the things that came up in the last interview that I spoke to you about. Like you said, you probably don't remember. But our campus newspaper, the UBC, was shut down by the student government. And this sort of really fits quite into your propaganda model. It was a kind of ironic that we were speaking right at the time when this was going on, just for publishing things that the student government didn't like. And one thing that surprised me was the student reaction, which generally was in favor of this action, ranging from apathy to people being really rabidly in favor of it. Why do people respond in this way to what is really a restriction of their rights for freedom of the press?
Well, I can't comment on the way people reacted there and why, and I don't even know what the issues are, but the general point that you're making is we see right through history. I mean, you take a look at slave societies. One phenomenon that there are plenty of revolts and so on and so forth, but you also find a good deal of voluntary subordination, and in fact, even feeling, well, this is the way the world ought to be. Take a look at at the status of women throughout history, which has often been, most of the time, in fact, pretty serious repression of one sort or another, but quite often it's supported by women. Just now, there's an amazing case. I just happened to come back from India, where there's a kind of an amazing case of it. There was a really horrible sort of gang rape affair in one province where the men were tried and released. There wasn't any question that they did it. There was kind of a caste issue involved and other things. But the men who carried out the rape are, by a large part of the population, considered heroes, and in fact are being lauded by women of that group and caste and so on. Well, okay, there's people who laud their oppression, and there's many reasons for this. And I don't know what the story is in the case you're talking about, but one can think of lots of possible reasons, and there are plenty of examples of it through history. Sometimes terror has that effect. A couple of years ago, the Central American Jesuits, in El Salvador, which was the main Jesuit center, it's where the 6 Jesuit intellectuals were murdered and so on. They had a interesting conference. It was just before the Salvadoran election, so it must have been, I guess, January 1994 or so. They had a conference in which they discussed the effect of the terrorism of the past decade. The United States had carried out a huge terrorist war in El Salvador, as in most of the region, and a lot of people were killed, 70,000, 80,000 people. And they pointed out that the terror has had a lot of effects. One of it is kind of sort of localized, and it just kills off dissidents and so on. But they also said there's a more general effect that should not be forgotten, namely what they call the culture of terror domesticates your aspirations, meaning you just lose hope and your framework changes and you look at things differently. You don't have expectations and you get your satisfaction elsewhere, or you try to get it. Often in a future life. That's what the message of the evangelical churches, strongly supported by the business community, like the Rockefellers and others for years, precisely because it tells you, don't worry about this life, worry about some other life. It'll be okay there. Actually, that was a good part of the Pope's message while he was going through Central America. And that's a traditional part of, it's not the whole church, but it's certainly a traditional part of the church, and one of the reasons for its massive business support. It tells people, everything's fine, just worry about your future life, you mean after, a future world. Make sure you say your prayers and all that sort of thing. And if people are stomping you in the face, that's insignificant. Well, you can understand why that's a useful message from certain points of view, but people do internalize it under various conditions.
Everyone's discussing the internet, so I thought I would ask you about it as well. Do you think the internet's going to lead us to some kind of information free flow heaven?
I think you can't answer that any more than you could say it about print or radio or television. The technology is pretty neutral; doesn't care how it's used. And that's true of most technology. But the distribution of power in the society will determine how it's used. The internet could become what the corporations want it to become, and what Bill Gates and so on even say they want it to become, namely a kind of a huge home shopping service and a way of atomizing and marginalizing people even more than they are, and so on. Could become that, and in fact, under corporate pressure, that's what it will become. Not because they're bad people, but because that's the nature of the institutions. On the other hand, it could become a method by which people can get together and go outside the power structure that dominates information flow and organize to do things that are not approved by power sectors, and to some extent that's happened already. And how this works out depends on what the balance of forces are, just as in the case of the print media, of the print technology can be used to liberate or can be used to oppress. There's nothing inherent in the technology that says how it's going to be used.
Professor Chomsky, it's Ian McKinnon again. Your comment on about sports that was also broadcast in the movie that was made by the National Film Board, bringing one aspect of how people are diverted from issues that are more important. I read where you said this is one of your comments that's gotten a huge amount of response, and I was wondering if you'd care to comment on the kind of response that you got and if you were expecting that.
Well, I don't know anything about the film, but for me this was kind of, probably a response to a question somewhere. It's nothing I've written about or concentrated on or said much about. But somewhere along the line I said something which I think is true and which may have been filmed, that the professional sports, with their sort of gladiator-like quality, have a lot of very negative aspects, in my view. For one thing, it makes it turns people into the role of spectators. For another, it inculcates completely irrational jingoism. Like, why should I, cheer for my college football team, which is basically professional athletes, or my sports team or something? What do I have to do with them? In fact, what does anybody around here have to do with them? But that kind of jingoist subordination is a very dangerous attitude. Now, it doesn't have to be like that. Like, there's nothing wrong with, there are other ways of looking at professional sports, but it does have those characteristics. And it, particularly when it reaches the level of fanaticism that you see in much of the world, incidentally, I think it's a pretty dangerous phenomenon to be concerned about. And I think it has a sort of a function, a social function, which is part of the reason why it gets so much advertising support and media support and so on. It does subordinate people and focus their energy and attention on something that doesn't matter from the point of view of power systems.
Pat Buchanan has just recently won the New Hampshire primaries, and I was wondering why you thought that the Christian fundamentalism in the U.S. had so much power versus, say, the labor vote or the black vote or other interests.
Well, for one thing, the U.S. has always been a very fundamentalist society. It's kind of off the spectrum, comparatively speaking. speaking. Canada is also pretty far off, but the United States is very far off. In part, there was simply direct business support for this. So business funding of evangelicals is very well known. In my view, there's been a lot of study of this, and it seems to be part of a whole range of other phenomena, much less, for example, very low level of unionization and of civil society altogether. Civil society, meaning organizations in which people get together to do things, is pretty low in the United States. In fact, it's radically declined in the last 30 years or so. At the same time, people are subjected to extraordinary propaganda. The United States is a very free society in many respects, maybe the freest in the world. On the other hand, it also is a business-run society to an extent that's unusual in the world. Business power cannot, and even doesn't want to appeal to state power to control people. That would be a threat to itself, for one thing. So it naturally resorts to other mechanisms. Propaganda is one. Diversion to religious fundamentalism is another. And this has its own roots. Back to just remember how the United States was settled, say where I live in Boston. The people who came over here and cleared this area, including massacring much of the population, they were fundamentalist extremists. They were the children of Israel coming to the promised land. And those forces remained and, in fact, have been stimulated and I think, in part, are a compensation for the lack of significant political participation. So take, say, the New Hampshire primary. For the general population in New Hampshire, they regarded it as a kind of a public relations show. The question that was obvious. It's kind of on a par with watching television ads. The candidates are marketed and packaged, and everybody knows it. The idea that this was you take a look at the exit polls. Not many people, either in New Hampshire or elsewhere, regarded this as an exercise in democratic participation. In fact, over 80% of the population doesn't think that there is any functioning democracy. And you couldn't watch the New Hampshire primaries and not see that this is just kind of marketing.
That's an interesting statistic you just quoted, that 80% of the population doesn't think there is a...
Well, I can be more precise on that if you want. There's a regular poll question that's asked, has been for years. Who do you think the government works for? And it's an open question, so you can get a lot of answers. But for years, about 50% was saying the government works for the few and the special interests, not for the people. Various wordings, but something like that. The last one I saw, which was 1994, it was 82%. Well, I interpret that as meaning 82% of the population doesn't think that the democratic system functions.
Now, do you think that means that America's ripe for a new wave of activism or anything like that, or?
Oh, I think this place is an organizer's paradise. People are desperate. It's interesting that in fact, Pat Buchanan, who is a total fraud, just look at his views 10 years ago or 5 years ago. But he recognizes that if he wants to gain personal power, he just has to appeal to feelings that are out there, and they happen to be very anti-capitalist. So he's, for good reason. So he's giving an anti-corporate message, which he doesn't believe for a second. If he was ever in power, it'd be another corporate flack. And it's the racism, which is very blatant. The evangelical phoniness. Probably doesn't believe a word of it. Judging by his past record, all of that is appealed. It's a recognition of that you've got a kind of demoralized population, frightened, angry, and you try to appeal to and, in fact, stimulate its worst instincts. In fact, after the 1992 Republican convention, there was commentary in Europe which was amazed at I don't know about Canada, but even in conservative European circles, like say the London economists, like what they call liberal, were kind of appalled by this guy I was pretty struck by it too. Actually, I looked back at things that I remembered from childhood, Hitler's rallies, and you look back at the speeches, and there was a striking similarity, and pretty good reasons for that similarity. When you're trying to organize popular support for actions that are going to be extremely harmful to the population, there aren't a lot of ways to do this. One way is by stimulating or playing on fear, anger, hatred, fanaticism, extremism, and so on. And everyone goes back to those formulas because there really aren't any others. Buchanan is an example.
The biggest event in Canada, I guess. I wonder if you followed the coverage of the Quebec referendum in the States and what you thought the prospects of an independent Quebec might be, especially in terms of how the U.S. might regard the prospects of an independent Quebec.
Yeah, actually, I happened to be in Montreal just a couple of days before the referendum.
No kidding.
So giving talks, and of course this came up all the time. I don't express. I mean, I think there are a lot of issues and people in Canada to figure them out, but so I'm not giving any advice. But as far as the U.S. Reaction would be, my guess would be, strong suspicion would be, that if Quebec received some formal independence, it would be nominal independence because it would pretty quickly become a U.S. colony. And I think that would accelerate the same tendency elsewhere in Canada.
Right.
I wonder if you find yourself writing the same sort of things over and over again, to the extent where you could just replace the words Vietnam with Iraq and change some of the details.
Well, in a sense that's true, but you could say the same about recorded history. I mean, you can take a look at the biblical period and find plenty of things that are similar to what we see now. But in the case of, say, talking about the United States or Western industrial democracies and so on, there happen to be pretty stable institutions over a long period, and power flows from institutions. And as a result, when you discuss how power is exercised with relatively stable institutions, you find similar themes cropping up over and over.
I was wondering, Professor Chomsky, if you were familiar with the work of a Vancouver writer named George Woodcock, and if you...
George Woodcock, who was the first?
George Woodcock, that was the only...
Who was the first person you mentioned?
I didn't mention that was the only person I mentioned.
Oh, okay, yeah, I thought...
He passed away last year. I was wondering if you care to comment on his career, or if you were aware of him, if you read his...
Yes, I've read his work. I thought he was he was an interesting historian of anarchism, had some interesting things to say. I think he was pretty doctrinaire and unwilling to understand things that were like a couple of millimeters away from his own point of view very often. But that's a human failing. I think he was a. I mean, I read what he writes with interest, and I'm happy that he wrote it for the most part, though disagreeing with some things.
In some ways, his experience, I would say, is mirrors yours in that here he is in Vancouver. He's the most prolific writer in Canada,
Mm-hmm.
and yet there isn't a George Woodcock Institute, and there's no sign that it even existed in the city in some ways. And I feel it almost mirrors your experience in the United States, whereas in Canada
just look at his message. To what sector of power and privilege was he appealing?
Well, he certainly wasn't appealing to the sectors of power.
Then
and
why
privilege.
should you expect the George Woodcock Institute endowed by Coca-Cola?
Yeah. Well,
it's not very subtle,
No.
We better let you go because your secretary said she would get you.
Yes.
She would be mad if
right.
if you went.
Very stern. Yeah. For good reasons, incidentally. It's a total madhouse here.
Yes. She said you'd keep talking until we stopped
Yeah,
you.
that's true.
But I was wondering if I could ask you a quick favor. If you could do a station identification for us.
What does that mean?
Could you say that?
What is the station?
It's a college radio station, so you could just say support college radio, or it's CITR 101.9. If you could just say your name's. No.
Could you say that again? I can't.
CITR 101.9.
Hold on. CIQR.
TR.
CIPR.
Right.
What was the number?
101.9 FM.
101.9 FM. And this is
It's a UBC
college, UBC
college radio.
college, student run or what?
Yeah, it's student run.
Hmm. So just say this is me speaking over this in a comment.
Right, and you can say
Yeah.
anything you
Yeah.
would like.
Okay. Do you want me to do that?
Sure.
This is Noam Chomsky. I'm speaking over CIPR 101.9 FM, UBC College Radio, at the end of an interesting interview. Independent radio, meaning outside the commercial and state system, has been a quite significant force for democratic participation, independent thinking, and so on, and merits substantial support in my view.
Sorry, could I just ask you one more favor? If you could,
Yeah.
we have another show called Polyfiller, which is after the BBC World Service.
What is it called?
It's called Polyfiller.
Polyfiller?
Yeah.
How do you spell it?
As in, POLYFILLER.
Polyfiller, yeah.
Right. I was wondering, and it's after the BBC World Service. So if you could just say something like, "This is Noam Chomsky."
Yeah, I don't know what it is, so I really can't
Okay.
comment on it. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Enjoy your stay in Vancouver. I hope you get a chance to appreciate our city.
Okay.
They don't
Hope
keep
to
you
see
too
there.
busy.
Yeah.
Take
Right.
care.
Bye.
Bye.